Broken by deceit. Lady Marjorie of Winthorne had been raised to despise Lord Edmund Warwick, the man responsible for her family's ruin. But when he lifted her veil, there was no cruelty in his gaze, only quiet challenge. "You expected a monster," he murmured. "Tell me, my lady, am I one?" Chapter 1. The Unveiling of a Foe. The chill of the chapel at Warwick keep it deeper than the late autumn air. It seeped into Marjorie's bones, a constant, gnawing reminder of where she was the heart of her enemy's stronghold. The scent of incense, usually a comfort, felt cloying, heavy with the weight of the vows she was about to make. Her fingers, clenched tightly around the worn wooden beads of her rosary, were numb, despite the thick fur lining of her gloves. "Our Lady, Mother of Mercy," she prayed silently, "give me strength." It wasn't strength she wanted, not truly. It was escape. But escape was a luxury Lady Marjorie of Winthorne could no longer afford. She stood stiffly, a statue carved from ice and resentment, draped in a gown of deep crimson velvet, the color of dried blood, a stark contrast to the Warwick colors of silver and gray that dominated the chapel. The fabric, though rich and heavy, did little to warm her. It felt like a shroud, burying her former life, her freedom, her very name. Winthorne was gone, its lands forfeit, its people scattered. And she, the last ember of its once proud flame, was to be extinguished here, in the cold embrace of Warwick Keep. The murmurs of the assembled guests were a dull hum, a swarm of bees buzzing around a doomed flower. She dared not look at them. Warwick retainers, mostly, their faces hard and unfamiliar. Perhaps a few sympathetic glances from those who remembered Winthorne before the fall, before Lord Edmund Warwick had swept down like a winter storm, leaving ruin in his wake. But sympathy was useless. It couldn't rebuild walls, restore fortunes, or bring back the dead. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the chapel creaked open, and a hush fell. Even the flickering candlelight seemed to hold its breath. He was coming. The man who had orchestrated her family's destruction, her forced marriage, her utter humiliation. Lord Edmund Warwick. Marjorie kept her gaze fixed on the altar, on the intricate carvings of saints and angels, their serene faces a mockery of her turmoil. She could feel his approach, the heavy tread of his boots on the stone floor, the subtle shift in the air, the collective intake of breath from the onlookers. Each step was a hammer blow against the remnants of her pride. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of him: soap, leather, and something indefinably him, a scent that was both alien and strangely not unpleasant. It was the scent of power, of a man accustomed to command. She refused to look at him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the fear, the hatred, that surely blazed in her eyes. The priest, a thin, nervous man with a voice that trembled slightly, began the ceremony. His words, the ancient Latin phrases of the marriage rite, washed over Marjorie like a cold, meaningless tide. She barely heard them, her mind a whirlwind of bitter memories and desperate prayers. She remembered her father, his face etched with despair as he'd told her of the impending marriage, the only way to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of their lives. "He demands it, Marjorie," he'd said, his voice hoarse with defeat. "It's the only way to ensure your safety, the safety of our people who remain." Safety. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. What safety could there be with the man who had taken everything from her? The priest droned on, prompting her for her vows. She repeated the words mechanically, her voice flat and lifeless. Marjorie, take the Edmund." Each syllable was a betrayal, a surrender. She felt a tear, hot and defiant, trace a path down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, refusing to let him, or anyone else, witness her weakness. Then came the moment she had dreaded. The unveiling. The tradition dictated that the groom lift the bride's veil, a symbolic gesture of possession, of unveiling the prize he had won. Marjorie held her breath, her body rigid with tension. She imagined his hands, strong and calloused, the hands of a warrior, reaching for her, claiming her. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against the delicate lace of her veil. She flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but she felt his hesitation. He paused, as if sensing her revulsion, her fear. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted the veil, revealing her face to him, to the assembled guests, to the world. For a long moment, silence reigned. Marjorie forced herself to meet his gaze. She expected to see triumph, cruelty, the cold satisfaction of a victor. But what she saw surprised her. His eyes, a startling shade of gray, like the storm clouds that gathered over the Warwick Hills, were not cold. They were searching. There was a weariness in them, a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it wasn't the blatant animosity she had anticipated. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a prize, but as a person. And in that gaze, she saw a flicker of something that almost resembled respect. Or perhaps it was simply curiosity. He was younger than she had imagined, though still hardened by years of warfare, no doubt. His face was lean and angular, framed by dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. There were lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the marks of a man who had seen too much, suffered too much. A thin scar traced a path across his left cheekbone, a silent testament to battles fought and won. He was undeniably handsome, in a harsh, uncompromising way, the kind of beauty that was forged in fire, not in gentle meadows. "You expected a monster," he murmured, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chapel. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. A challenge. Marjorie's chin lifted slightly. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Tell me, my lady," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "am I one?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of their shared history, with the impossible chasm that separated them. Marjorie stared back at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to call him every vile name she could think of. But she couldn't. Something in his eyes, that strange, unsettling mixture of weariness and challenge, held her captive. I do not know," she finally whispered, the words barely audible, even to her own ears. It was the truth. She didn't know. She thought she knew. She had been raised to believe he was the devil incarnate, the embodiment of everything evil and cruel. But now, standing before him, seeing the complex emotions that flickered in his eyes, she was forced to confront the unsettling possibility that the truth was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. And that realization, that tiny seed of doubt, was more terrifying than anything she had faced before. She was bound to a man she did not know, a man who held her fate in his hands, and the only certainty was that her life, as she had known it, was over. The game had changed before it had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers of Winthorne's Fall. The feasting hall of Warwick Keep was a cacophony of sound and smell. The celebratory meal following the wedding was in full swing, though the celebration felt hollow to Marjorie. The long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, steaming pies, and flagons of ale and wine. Torches blazed in iron sconces along the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced with the revelry. The air was thick with the aroma of wood smoke, roasted boar, and spilled ale, a heady mix that did little to settle her churning stomach. Marjorie sat beside Edmund at the high table, a silent, unwilling participant in the festivities. She picked at her food, a small portion of roasted chicken and some bread, barely tasting it. Her gaze drifted across the hall, taking in the unfamiliar faces of the Warwick retainers. They were a boisterous lot, their laughter loud and unrestrained, their voices fueled by drink and the satisfaction of a victory well celebrated. She saw the way they looked at her, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, with perhaps a hint of pity thrown in for good measure. She was the conquered, the spoils of war, a living reminder of Winthorne's defeat. Edmund, to his credit, made no attempt to force her into conversation. He seemed preoccupied, his gaze often drifting towards the lower tables, where his men were gathered. He spoke sparingly, mostly to his closest advisers, men with hard faces and watchful eyes. Marjorie sensed a tension in him, a coiled energy that belied his outward calm. He was a warrior, she reminded herself, a man accustomed to conflict, to strategy, to the constant threat of betrayal. Even in celebration, he remained vigilant. She found herself studying him, trying to reconcile the image of the ruthless conqueror with the man who had looked at her with such unsettling intensity in the chapel. He was a puzzle, a contradiction. And she, bound to him by vows she had not chosen, was forced to unravel the mystery of him, if only to survive. A group of minstrels began to play, their lively tunes filling the hall. Some of the guests rose to dance, their movements clumsy and boisterous. Marjorie watched them, feeling a pang of longing for the familiar dances of Winthorne, for the laughter and camaraderie of her own people. But those days were gone, lost forever in the ashes of her former life. A serving girl, young and timid, approached the high table, offering Marjorie a goblet of wine. Marjorie shook her head, declining. The girl hesitated, then offered it to Edmund. He took it, his fingers brushing against the girl's hand. Marjorie noticed the way the girl blushed, the way she lowered her gaze. A flicker of admiration? Fear? It was hard to tell. But it was clear that Edmund Warwick inspired a complex mix of emotions in those around him. As the evening wore on, the whispers began. Marjorie couldn't hear the exact words, but she could feel the weight of them, the subtle glances, the furtive conversations. They were talking about her, about Winthorne, about the circumstances of her marriage. She knew the stories that were circulating, the rumors, the half-truths. She was the Ice Queen, the cold, unyielding daughter of a defeated lord, forced into a marriage with the man who had destroyed her family. She was a symbol of Warwick's triumph, a trophy to be displayed, a reminder of his power. She felt a hand on her arm, a light, tentative touch. She turned to see a woman standing beside her, her face etched with concern. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wore the simple garb of a lady-in-waiting, but there was a quiet dignity about her that commanded respect. "My lady," the woman said softly, her voice barely audible above the din of the hall. "I am Alara, one of Lord Edmund's kinswomen. I wish to offer you my welcome, however belated." Marjorie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She was wary of kindness, of any gesture that might be a veiled attempt to further humiliate her. But there was something in Alara's eyes, a sincerity that seemed genuine. "Thank you," Marjorie replied, her voice stiff. Alara smiled again, a sad, knowing smile. "I know this is difficult for you," she said. "Winthorne was a beautiful place. I remember visiting there many years ago when I was a girl." Marjorie's heart clenched. It was the first time anyone had spoken of Winthorne with anything other than disdain or pity. You knew Winthorne?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alara nodded. "My father had dealings with your grandfather," she said. "They were friends of a sort. Before the Troubles." The Troubles. That was what they called it. A euphemism for the brutal campaign that had brought Winthorne to its knees. Marjorie looked away, unable to meet Alara's gaze. The memories were too raw, too painful. "I know what they say about Lord Edmund," Alara continued, her voice low and confidential. "They call him ruthless, cold-hearted. And perhaps he is, at times. He has had to be. But he is not without honor. Or compassion." Marjorie's gaze snapped back to Alara. "Compassion?" she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "He showed no compassion to my family, to my people." Alara sighed. "War is a cruel mistress, my lady," she said. "It forces men to make difficult choices, choices that haunt them long after the battles are over. Lord Edmund, he carries the weight of those choices. He does not speak of it, but I see it in his eyes." Marjorie wanted to scoff, to dismiss Alara's words as the foolish ramblings of a loyal kinswoman. But she couldn't. She had seen something in Edmund's eyes too, that flicker of weariness, of something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "He could have killed us all," Marjorie said, her voice barely a whisper. He could have razed Winthorne to the ground. He could have, Alara agreed. But he didn't. He offered you marriage, a chance to rebuild. It was not an act of kindness, perhaps, but it was a chance. A chance for survival. A chance. The word echoed in Marjorie's mind. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble. But it was all she had left. She was bound to Edmund Warwick, to the man who had taken everything from her. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to navigate this treacherous path, to find a way to survive, to even thrive. She looked at Alara, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and for the first time since arriving at Warwick Keep, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness. The hope was precarious, fragile as a newborn bird, but it was there. And she would cling to it, fiercely, desperately, as she navigated the treacherous currents of her new life. The whispers continued, but now, Marjorie was ready to listen, to learn, to understand the man she had married and the world she now inhabited. She would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. Chapter 3. The Warwick Legacy of Ice. The morning after the wedding dawned gray and cold, mirroring the chill that had settled deep within Marjorie's soul. She awoke in a large, unfamiliar chamber, the heavy drapes drawn against the weak sunlight. The room was opulent, furnished with richly carved furniture and thick tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and warfare. The Warwick family crest a silver falcon on a field of gray prominently displayed. But it felt cold, impersonal, a stark contrast to the smaller, more intimate chambers of her childhood home. She rose and dressed quickly, aided by a silent, efficient serving woman who had been assigned to her. The woman, whose name was Agnes, offered no conversation, no warmth, only a practiced obedience that made Marjorie feel even more isolated. She chose a simple gown of gray wool, a concession to her new surroundings, though she refused to wear the Warwick falcon. She would not erase Winthorne completely, not yet. As she left the chamber, she found herself navigating a maze of corridors, the stone walls cold and imposing. The castle was vast, a labyrinth of interconnected buildings, courtyards, and towers. It was a fortress, built for defense, not for comfort. She felt lost, disoriented, a stranger in a hostile land. She eventually found her way to the small chapel where she had been married the previous day. It was empty now, the candles extinguished, the scent of incense lingering faintly in the air. She knelt before the altar, seeking solace in prayer, but the words felt empty, hollow. She was praying for strength, for guidance, but she felt no connection to the divine, only a vast, echoing emptiness. A sound behind her made her turn. Edmund stood in the doorway, watching her. He was dressed in dark, practical clothing, a leather jerkin over a linen shirt, his sword strapped to his side. He looked less imposing than he had the previous day, less like a conquering lord and more like a man burdened by responsibilities. "I did not expect to find you here," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of any mockery. Marjorie rose, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I needed a moment of peace," she replied, her voice stiff. He nodded, understanding flashing in his gray eyes. "This place, it can be overwhelming," he said. "It was built for war, not for solace." He moved further into the chapel, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He stopped beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the subtle warmth radiating from his body. "My father built most of this," he said, gesturing around the chapel. "He was a hard man. Driven. He believed in strength, in power, in the absolute authority of the Warwick name." Marjorie listened, her gaze fixed on the intricate carvings of the altar. She knew something of the Warwick history, the long line of ruthless lords who had ruled this land for generations. They were known for their cold efficiency, their unwavering loyalty to the crown, and their brutal suppression of any dissent. "He was obsessed with legacy," Edmund continued, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "He wanted to ensure that the Warwick name would endure, that our power would remain unchallenged. He sacrificed everything for that goal, including his own happiness." Marjorie glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. He was speaking of his father, of the weight of the Warwick legacy, and she sensed a deep-seated conflict within him. "My mother died when I was young," he said, his gaze drifting towards a small, stained glass window depicting the Virgin Mary. "She was different, gentler. She loved music, poetry, the beauty of the natural world. She tried to soften my father's harshness, but she failed." He paused, a muscle flickering in his jaw. "He blamed her for my weakness," he said, the word laced with self-deprecating irony. "He saw any sign of compassion, of empathy, as a flaw. He trained me to be a warrior, to be ruthless, to be like him." Marjorie felt a strange stirring of pity. It was a dangerous emotion, one she couldn't afford to indulge. But she couldn't deny the sadness she heard in his voice, the unspoken longing for something he had never known. "He arranged my first marriage," Edmund continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "to a woman I barely knew. A political alliance, of course. She died in childbirth. Along with our son." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. Marjorie looked at him, seeing the pain etched in the lines around his eyes, the shadows that haunted his gaze. He had suffered loss, just as she had. He was not the monster she had imagined, but a man scarred by tragedy, burdened by the weight of his family's history. "I understand loss," she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain reflected in her own gaze, the shared understanding of grief and sorrow. For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a fragile connection, a shared humanity that transcended their roles as conqueror and conquered. "Winthorn," he said, his voice hesitant. I did not want to destroy it. I offered your father terms. He refused." Marjorie's fists clenched. "He would not surrender to a Warwick," she said, the words laced with bitterness. Edmund nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Pride," he said. "It can be a powerful force, and a destructive one." He looked at her, his gaze intense, probing. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said, "or to forget what I have done. But I hope that we can find a way to coexist, to build something new, from the ashes." He offered no promises, no apologies, only a stark, honest assessment of their situation. He was offering her a chance, not for love, not for happiness, but for survival. And in that moment, Marjorie realized that she had a choice to make. She could cling to her hatred, to her grief, to the memory of Winthorn. Or she could accept the reality of her situation and try to forge a new path, a new life, in this cold, unforgiving place. The choice was hers, and hers alone. The legacy of ice was strong, but she began to consider the possibility of a fire within. It was a dangerous, terrifying thought, but it was all she had. The future had presented itself in a form, human and vulnerable. Chapter 4. A Dance of Duty and Distrust. The days that followed settled into a strained, uneasy rhythm. Marjorie found herself navigating the complex social landscape of Warwick Keep, a world of unspoken rules, hidden alliances, and simmering resentments. She was an outsider, a constant reminder of Winthorn's defeat, and she felt the weight of watchful eyes, the subtle whispers that followed her wherever she went. She spent much of her time exploring the castle, familiarizing herself with its layout, its routines, its inhabitants. She discovered hidden gardens, tucked away in secluded courtyards, where she could find a few moments of solitude, a brief respite from the constant scrutiny. She frequented the library, a vast, dusty chamber filled with ancient texts and forgotten lore. She found solace in the written word, losing herself in stories of long-ago battles, of brave knights and fair ladies, of kingdoms won and lost. She also began to observe the people of Warwick Keep, trying to understand their loyalties, their motivations, their relationships with Edmund. She learned to distinguish between the hardened warriors, the ambitious courtiers, the loyal servants, and the few who seemed genuinely kind, like Alara, who continued to offer her quiet support and friendship. Edmund remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He was often absent, attending to the affairs of his vast estates, dealing with disputes, overseeing the training of his men. When he was present, he treated her with a formal courtesy, a respectful distance that kept them separated by an invisible wall. He made no demands on her, offered no false affection, only a cold, pragmatic acceptance of their situation. Yet, she sensed a change in him, a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed less guarded, less consumed by the weight of his responsibilities. She sometimes caught him watching her, his gaze lingering on her face, a flicker of curiosity? Interest? It was hard to tell. But it was clear that he was observing her, assessing her, trying to understand the woman he had married. One evening, she found herself in the great hall, watching a group of knights practicing their swordsmanship. The clash of steel, the grunts of exertion, the shouts of encouragement, filled the air. It was a scene of controlled violence, of disciplined aggression, a reminder of the constant threat of war that permeated their lives. Edmund was among them, his movements fluid and graceful, his skill evident in every parry, every thrust. He was a formidable warrior, a master of his craft. Marjorie watched him, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and fear. He was her husband, her protector, but he was also her enemy, the man who had destroyed her family. As he fought, his gaze met hers across the hall. He paused, his sword lowered, a flicker of something in his eyes. He nodded to her, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his opponent, and the fight resumed. Later that evening, she encountered him in a quiet corridor near the entrance to the library. He was alone, his sword sheathed, his face etched with fatigue. "You are skilled with the blade," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. He glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "It is a necessary skill," he replied. "In this world." "My brother, he was a skilled swordsman too," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He taught me a little." Edmund's expression softened slightly. "I did not know you had a brother." He died. "At Winthorne," she said, the words catching in her throat. He nodded, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "I am sorry," he said. The words were simple, but they felt genuine. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint echo of voices from the great hall. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared history, with the impossible chasm that separated them. "I do not expect you to like me," he said, his voice low. "But I hope that we can at least respect each other." Respect. It was a strange word, a cold word, but it was better than hatred, better than fear. It was a starting point, a foundation upon which they could perhaps build something different. "Respect is earned," she replied, her voice firm, "not given freely." He met her gaze, a flicker of challenge in his eyes. "Then I shall endeavor to earn it, my lady," he said. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of formal courtesy, and then turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the corridor. Marjorie watched him go, her heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She was still wary, still distrustful, but she was also intrigued. He was not the monster she had expected, but a complex, enigmatic man, burdened by his past, struggling to find his way in a world of violence and betrayal. And she, bound to him by fate, was caught in the intricate dance of duty and distrust, a dance that could lead to either destruction or something else entirely. A future, however fragile. She had a part to play, and it was time to play it. The dance had begun. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Great Hall. The days shortened, and the nights grew longer, the chill of autumn deepening into the icy grip of winter. Warwick Keep, perched high on its rocky outcrop, felt increasingly isolated, a fortress besieged by the elements. The wind howled around the towers, rattling the windows and sending icy drafts whistling through the corridors. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white, obscuring the paths and making travel treacherous. Marjorie found herself spending more and more time indoors, seeking refuge from the harsh weather. She continued to explore the castle, discovering hidden nooks and crannies, secret passages and forgotten chambers. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in the ancient texts, seeking knowledge, understanding, anything to distract her from the constant awareness of her precarious situation. She also began to attend the evening meals in the great hall more regularly, a silent observer of the Warwick court. She learned to decipher the subtle cues, the unspoken alliances, the simmering rivalries that played out beneath the surface of polite conversation. She saw the way the courtiers vied for Edmund's favor, the way they flattered him, the way they sought to influence his decisions. She also saw the way he handled them, with a mixture of firmness and diplomacy, always maintaining his authority, always keeping them at a distance. One evening, as she sat at the high table, listening to the usual banter and gossip, she noticed a group of men huddled in a corner, their voices low, their expressions conspiratorial. They were strangers, not the usual Warwick retainers. She recognized one of them as Lord Renfrew, a powerful nobleman from a neighboring territory. He was known for his ambition, his ruthlessness, and his dislike of Edmund Warwick. She watched them, her senses heightened, a feeling of unease prickling at her skin. They were plotting something, she was sure of it. But what? And against whom? She glanced at Edmund, who was engaged in conversation with one of his advisors. He seemed oblivious to the clandestine meeting taking place across the hall. She wanted to warn him, to alert him to the potential danger, but she hesitated. She was still an outsider, a stranger, and her words might be dismissed, or worse, misinterpreted. As the evening wore on, the conspiratorial meeting broke up and the men dispersed, mingling with the other guests. Lord Renfrew approached the high table, a forced smile on his face. "Lord Edmund," he said, his voice smooth and oily. "A pleasure to see you again. And Lady Marjorie," he added, turning to her with a bow. "You are a vision of loveliness, even in this austere setting." Marjorie forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Lord Renfrew," she replied, her voice steady. "It is an honor to have you as our guest." Renfrew's smile widened, revealing a hint of cruelty in his eyes. "I have come to discuss matters of mutual interest with Lord Edmund," he said. "Matters that could benefit us both." Edmund nodded, his expression guarded. "I am always open to discussion," he said. "Perhaps we can speak privately after the meal." Renfrew agreed, and the conversation turned to other matters, but Marjorie couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She sensed a trap, a carefully laid plan to undermine Edmund, to weaken his position, perhaps even to overthrow him. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, she found herself pacing her chamber, her mind racing. She had to warn Edmund, but how? She couldn't simply accuse Renfrew without proof, without risking her own position. She needed to be careful, to be strategic. She decided to seek out Alara, the only person in Warwick Keep she felt she could trust. She found her in her small, cozy chamber, nestled near the kitchens. Alara welcomed her with a warm smile, offering her a cup of spiced wine. Marjorie explained her concerns, her voice low and urgent. Alara listened intently, her expression growing increasingly serious. "Lord Renfrew is a dangerous man," Alara said, her voice grave. "He has long coveted Warwick's lands, his power. He would not hesitate to use any means necessary to achieve his goals." "I saw them plotting," Marjorie said. "I don't know what they were planning, but I know it was something against Edmund." Alara nodded. "We must be careful," she said. "We cannot accuse him openly, without proof. But we can watch him, observe his movements, his contacts, and we must warn Edmund subtly." They devised a plan, a way to alert Edmund to the potential danger without revealing Marjorie's suspicions directly. They would use coded language, subtle hints, to convey their concerns. They would enlist the help of a few trusted servants, loyal to Edmund, to keep an eye on Renfrew and his men. Leaving the warmth of Alara's room felt like stepping into a frozen sea. Back in her own chamber, Marjorie felt sleep was an impossibility. The shadows of the great hall seemed to follow her, whispering threats. She knew this was more than a simple political maneuver. It felt personal, dangerous, a threat not just to Edmund's power, but to his life. And, strangely, The thought filled her not with satisfaction, but with a cold, creeping dread. The shadows were real, and they were closing in. She had chosen a side, however silently. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Chapter 6. The Falcon and the Dove. The following days were filled with a tense, unspoken anticipation. Marjorie continued her routine, attending to her duties, observing the comings and goings of the castle, but her senses were constantly on alert. She watched Lord Renfrew and his men, noting their movements, their conversations, their interactions with the other members of the court. She looked for any clue, any hint of their plans, but they were careful, discreet, revealing nothing openly. She and Ilara continued their secret communications, exchanging coded messages, sharing their observations, their concerns. They enlisted the help of a few trusted servants, loyal to Edmund, to act as their eyes and ears, gathering information, reporting anything suspicious. Marjorie found herself increasingly drawn to the Falconry Mews, a secluded area of the castle where Edmund kept his hunting birds. She had always been fascinated by falcons, by their fierce beauty, their independent spirit, their deadly grace. She admired their strength, their courage, their ability to soar above the world, to see everything from a different perspective. She spent hours watching the birds, observing their behavior, learning their names, their individual personalities. She befriended the falconer, a gruff, taciturn man named Osric, who was fiercely loyal to Edmund. He taught her about the art of falconry, about the training, the care, the handling of these magnificent creatures. One afternoon, as she was watching Osric work with a particularly beautiful peregrine falcon, a bird named Shadow, Edmund appeared at the entrance to the mews. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You seem to have a fondness for these creatures," he said, his voice quiet. Marjorie turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. "They are magnificent," she replied. "So free." He nodded, understanding flashing in his gray eyes. "Freedom is a precious thing," he said, "and easily lost." He moved closer, his gaze fixed on Shadow, the peregrine falcon perched on Osric's gloved hand. "This one she reminds me of you," he said, a hint of something in his voice. Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. "Me?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "How so?" He looked at her, his gaze intense, probing.
"She is proud," he said.
"Independent."
"Fierce."
"And beautiful." The compliment, unexpected and surprisingly sincere, sent a warmth flooding through her cheeks. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. "She is also a hunter," he continued. "A predator. She is not afraid to fight for what she wants." Marjorie looked up at him, her heart pounding. He was speaking of the falcon, but she knew he was also speaking of her. He was challenging her, encouraging her, to embrace her strength, her courage, her own inner predator. I am not a hunter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Perhaps not yet," he said, "but you have the spirit of one. I see it in your eyes." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had touched her willingly, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but out of something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "Be careful, my lady," he said, his voice low, urgent. "There are dangers here, within these walls, and without." He was warning her, she realized. He knew about Renfrew, about the plot, about the threat to his life. He was trusting her, sharing his concerns, seeking her alliance? I know, she said, her voice firm. "I will be careful." He held her gaze and nodded once. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with Osric and the falcons. Marjorie watched him go, her mind racing. He had acknowledged the danger, the threat, and he had trusted her. It was a small gesture, a subtle shift in their relationship, but it was significant. It was a recognition of her strength, her intelligence, her worth. She looked at Shadow, the peregrine falcon, perched on Osric's hand. The bird seemed to embody everything Edmund had said about her. Proud, independent, fierce, and beautiful. And, yes, a hunter, a predator. She realized that she was no longer the dove, the innocent victim, the helpless pawn in a game of power. She was the falcon, the hunter, the one who would fight for what she believed in, for what she wanted. And she wanted to survive. To protect Edmund. To protect herself. To protect the fragile hope that was beginning to blossom within her, a hope for a future, a life that was not defined by hatred and fear, but by something else. Something more. The falcon and the dove were becoming one, a dangerous, unpredictable combination. And she was ready to embrace it. The hunt had begun. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The tension within Warwick Keep grew palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud that hung over everyone. Marjorie moved through the castle like a ghost, her senses on high alert, constantly watching, listening, gathering information. She and Alara continued their clandestine meetings, sharing their observations, refining their plan. They were careful, discreet, knowing that one wrong move could expose them, could endanger them both. She noticed that Edmund was increasingly withdrawn, his face etched with worry, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He spent long hours in his study, poring over maps, documents, reports. He was preparing for something, she knew, but he wouldn't tell her what. One evening, she found him in the library, standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames. He was alone, his shoulders slumped, his posture radiating a deep weariness. She hesitated, unsure whether to intrude. But something in his demeanor, a vulnerability she had rarely seen, drew her to him. "Are you well?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, startled by her presence. He hadn't heard her approach. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, undisguised pain. "I have received word," he said, his voice hoarse, "from one of my informants. Renfrew is planning to move against me.
Soon."
Marjorie's heart clenched. The threat was real, imminent. What will you do?" she asked. He shook his head, his gaze returning to the fire.
"I do not know," he said.
"I have few allies. Most of the neighboring lords are wary of me, or openly hostile." He was trapped, surrounded by enemies, with few resources, few options. Marjorie felt a surge of protectiveness. It was a strange, unfamiliar emotion, one she had never expected to feel for the man who had destroyed her family. "You have your men," she said, her voice hesitant. "They are loyal." He nodded.
"They are."
"But they are outnumbered. Renfrew has been gathering support for months. He has mercenaries, paid soldiers, ruthless and well-equipped." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I have made many enemies," he said. "I have done terrible things. In the name of duty. In the name of the Warwick legacy." He was confessing to her, revealing his vulnerabilities, his regrets. He was showing her the scars of his past, the wounds that had never healed. "I understand," she said softly. "I have my own scars." He looked at her, seeing the pain reflected in her own gaze, the shared understanding of loss and sorrow. For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to crumble, replaced by a fragile empathy, a shared humanity. "My father, he pushed me," Edmund said, his voice choked with emotion. He demanded perfection. Obedience. He would not tolerate weakness. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He beat me," he said, the words barely audible. "When I failed. When I showed compassion. When I questioned his authority." Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined this. She had seen him as a ruthless conqueror, a cold-hearted warrior, but now she saw him as a victim, a child abused by his own father, forced to become something he was not. I am sorry," she said, the words inadequate, but sincere. He shook his head. "Do not pity me," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "I do not deserve it. Pity is not what I feel," she said, her voice firm. I understand. My father, he was not cruel, but he was distant. He loved Winthorne more than he loved me. Or my brother." She was sharing her own pain, her own vulnerabilities with him. It was a risk, a dangerous exposure, but she felt compelled to do it. She needed him to understand that she was not his enemy, that she was something else. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions, with the shared weight of their pasts, with the fragile beginnings of trust. "We are both scarred," he said, his voice low. "By our families. By our legacies." "But we are not our families," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We can choose our own paths. We can forge our own destinies." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. It was a faint glimmer, but it was there. A spark in the darkness. "Perhaps," he said, his voice hesitant, "but it is not easy to break free from the past." "No," she agreed. "It is not easy. But it is possible. We can help each other." She reached out, her hand touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of support, of connection. It was the first time she had touched him willingly, without hesitation, without fear. He flinched slightly at her touch, but then he relaxed, his muscles loosening, his gaze softening. The scars were deep, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to heal. Together. The past was a burden, but the future was still unwritten. And in that moment, Marjorie knew that she would fight for that future, for him, for herself, for the possibility of something more. The shared vulnerability had forged a new link, stronger than duty, stronger than fear. It was the beginning of something real. Chapter 8. A glimmer of unexpected warmth. The days that followed were marked by a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between Marjorie and Edmund. The shared vulnerability they had experienced in the library had created a fragile bond, a tentative understanding that transcended their roles as husband and wife, as conqueror and conquered. They began to talk, to truly communicate, not just about the impending threat from Renfrew, but about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Marjorie found herself seeking out Edmund's company, drawn to his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his dry wit. She discovered that he had a passion for knowledge, a love of learning that mirrored her own. They spent hours in the library together, discussing ancient texts, debating philosophical ideas, sharing their interpretations of history and legend. She also learned more about his past, about the harsh upbringing that had shaped him, the constant pressure to live up to the Warwick legacy, the loss of his first wife and child. She saw the pain that still lingered in his eyes, the shadows that haunted his dreams. And he, in turn, learned more about her love for Winthorne, her devotion to her family, her grief over the loss of her brother, her fear of the future. He saw the strength that lay beneath her quiet exterior, the resilience that had allowed her to survive the destruction of her world. One cold, clear afternoon, they found themselves walking together in the castle gardens, the snow crunching beneath their feet. The wind had died down, and the sun, though weak, cast a pale golden light over the snow-covered landscape. "It is beautiful," Marjorie said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "Even in winter." Edmund nodded, his gaze following hers. "My mother, she loved the gardens," he said. "She tried to soften the harshness of this place. She planted roses and herbs and flowers of all kinds." He pointed to a small, secluded corner of the garden, where a few hardy rose bushes, their branches bare and covered in frost, stood sentinel. "She called it her sanctuary," he said. "A place of peace and beauty." Marjorie looked at him, seeing the sadness in his eyes, the longing for the mother he had lost too soon. She felt a pang of empathy, a shared understanding of the pain of losing a loved one. "I had a garden too," she said softly. "At Winthorne. It was smaller, but I loved it. I grew herbs and flowers for healing." He turned to her, his eyes filled with interest. "Healing?" he echoed. She nodded. "My mother, she taught me the properties of plants, how to make potions and salves, to ease pain and heal wounds." He looked at her, a flicker of admiration, respect, in his eyes. "You are full of surprises, my lady," he said. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And you, my lord," she replied, "are not what I expected." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind through the bare branches of the trees. The air between them was no longer charged with tension, with distrust, but with something else. Something warmer. Something hopeful. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a passionate gesture, not a declaration of love, but a simple acknowledgement of their connection, their growing understanding, their friendship. I am glad, he said, his voice low, hesitant, that you are here, with me. The words, unexpected and surprisingly sincere, took her breath away. She looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the honesty in his expression. He was not just her husband, her captor, but a man who was reaching out to her, seeking her companionship, her support, her understanding. And she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I am glad to be here.
It was not a lie.
She was still wary, still cautious, but she could no longer deny the growing warmth she felt for him, the respect, the affection. It was a dangerous emotion, one she had not expected to feel, but it was there, undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. They continued their walk, their conversation flowing easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years, not just weeks. They talked about their hopes for the future, their fears, their dreams. They talked about the challenges they faced, the threat from Renfrew, the uncertain political landscape. And as they talked, Marjorie realized that she was no longer alone. She had found an ally, a friend, a companion, in the most unexpected of places. In the heart of her enemy's stronghold, in the arms of the man who had destroyed her world, she had found a glimmer of unexpected warmth, a spark of hope in the darkness. The future was still uncertain, still fraught with danger, but she was no longer afraid. She had him. He had her. And together, they would face whatever came their way. The warmth was a fragile thing, but it was real. And it was growing. Chapter 9. The Tournament of Treachery. Lord Renfrew announced a tournament, a grand display of martial prowess and chivalry, ostensibly to celebrate the recent marriage of Lord Edmund and Lady Marjorie, but in reality, a thinly veiled challenge to Edmund's authority and a demonstration of Renfrew's own power and influence. The news spread through Warwick Keep like wildfire, creating a buzz of excitement and anticipation, but Marjorie felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She knew this was more than just a game, more than just a friendly competition. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated plan to weaken Edmund, to humiliate him, perhaps even to kill him. She shared her concerns with Alara, who agreed that the tournament was a dangerous gambit. They intensified their efforts to gather information, to uncover Renfrew's true intentions, but he was careful, discreet, revealing nothing openly. Edmund, despite his own reservations, accepted Renfrew's challenge. He could not refuse without appearing weak, without losing face in front of his own men and the assembled nobility. He began to prepare for the tournament, spending long hours practicing his swordsmanship, honing his skills, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Marjorie watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. She admired his courage, his determination, his unwavering commitment to his duty, but she feared for his safety, for his life. She knew that Renfrew would use any means necessary to win, that he would not hesitate to employ treachery, deceit, even murder. She decided to use her knowledge of herbs and healing to help Edmund, to give him an edge in the competition. She spent hours in the castle gardens, gathering plants, preparing potions and salves that would enhance his strength, his stamina, his reflexes. She worked in secret, late at night, in her own chamber, away from prying eyes. One evening, as she was grinding herbs in a mortar, Edmund entered her chamber unannounced. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. Marjorie hesitated, unsure whether to reveal her secret. But she knew she could trust him, that he would not betray her. "I am preparing remedies," she said, "to help you. In the tournament." He looked at her, surprised by her answer. "You would do that?" he asked. "For me?" She nodded. I want you to be safe, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He moved closer, his gaze softening. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers. "You care about me," he said, a hint of wonder in his voice. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. A recognition of the growing bond between them, the affection that had blossomed in the midst of their shared adversity. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I do." The admission, spoken aloud, hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared history, with the fragile hope for a future together. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face.
"Thank you," he said, "for everything."
He took the mortar and pestle from her hands, and together, they continued to prepare the remedies, working side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, their gazes meeting, their hearts beating in unison. The tournament loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but in that small chamber, surrounded by the scent of herbs and the warmth of their shared purpose, they found a moment of peace, a glimmer of hope, a fragile connection that transcended the dangers that awaited them. The day of the tournament dawned bright and cold, the sky a clear, unforgiving blue. The castle grounds were transformed into a festive arena, with banners flying, tents pitched, and crowds of spectators gathered to watch the spectacle. The air was filled with the sounds of trumpets, the clash of steel, the cheers of the crowd. Edmund, dressed in his finest armor, his silver falcon crest gleaming on his chest, looked every inch the warrior lord. He rode into the arena, his head held high, his gaze steady, his demeanor confident. But Marjorie knew that beneath the surface, he was nervous, apprehensive, aware of the dangers he faced. The tournament began with a series of justs, knights charging at each other with lances leveled, the impact of their collisions echoing through the arena. Edmund performed well, unseating several opponents, his skill and strength evident in every move. But Marjorie noticed that Renfrew's men were fighting dirty, using unfair tactics, targeting Edmund's horse, his armor, his vulnerabilities. She watched from the stands, her heart pounding, her hands clenched into fists. She felt helpless, unable to intervene, unable to protect him. She could only watch and pray and hope that he would survive. The final joust was between Edmund and Renfrew himself. The crowd went silent, the tension palpable. They charged at each other, their lances meeting with a deafening crash. Edmund's lance struck true, unseating Renfrew, sending him tumbling to the ground. But as Edmund rode past, Renfrew rose to his feet, drew his sword, and charged at Edmund's exposed back. It was a blatant act of treachery, a violation of all the rules of chivalry. Marjorie screamed, a wordless cry of terror, but it was too late. Renfrew's sword struck Edmund's back, piercing his armor, drawing blood. Edmund reeled in his saddle, but he managed to stay mounted, his grip on his own sword tightening. The crowd erupted in outrage, shouting their condemnation of Renfrew's treachery. But Renfrew ignored them, his eyes filled with a cold, ruthless determination. He advanced on Edmund, his sword raised, ready to deliver the final blow. This was the moment. The trap had sprung, and Marjorie knew she had to act, or everything would be lost. Chapter 10. Confessions under the cloak of night. The uproar in the stands was deafening, a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Marjorie, her heart pounding in her chest, scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything, to help Edmund. But what? She was unarmed, surrounded by Renfrew's men, with no way to reach the field in time. She saw Osric, the falconer, standing nearby, his face pale with shock and anger. He held Shadow, Edmund's prized peregrine falcon, perched on his gloved hand. An idea, desperate and reckless, sparked in Marjorie's mind. She rushed to Osric, her voice urgent, desperate. "Osric, the falcon! Release her." Osric looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "My lady? But that is forbidden. It is against the rules. There are no rules anymore." Marjorie cried. "Renfrew has broken them all. He is trying to kill Edmund. Release the falcon."
"Now."
Osric hesitated for a moment, his loyalty to Edmund warring with his ingrained obedience to the rules of the tournament. But he saw the desperation in Marjorie's eyes, the unwavering determination in her gaze. He knew she was right. This was no longer a game. It was a fight for survival. He removed the hood from Shadow's head and, with a flick of his wrist, released the falcon. Shadow soared into the air, her powerful wings carrying her swiftly towards the center of the arena. Renfrew, his sword raised to strike Edmund, was momentarily distracted by the sudden appearance of the falcon. He glanced up, his eyes widening in surprise. Shadow, circling above, let out a piercing shriek, then dove, her talons extended, aiming straight for Renfrew's face. The attack was swift and unexpected. Renfrew cried out in pain, his sword clattering to the ground as he instinctively raised his hands to protect his eyes. The falcon's talons raked across his face, drawing blood, blinding him momentarily. Edmund, seizing the opportunity, spurred his horse forward, his own sword raised. He brought the blade down, not to kill, but to disarm. The sword struck Renfrew's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Renfrew, blinded and disarmed, stumbled backward, his face a mask of blood and pain. The crowd roared its approval, their outrage turning to cheers for Edmund, for the falcon, for the unexpected turn of events. Edmund's men rushed onto the field, surrounding Renfrew, taking him prisoner. The tournament was over. The treachery had been exposed. Edmund, though wounded, had survived. Marjorie, her legs trembling, made her way to the field, pushing through the crowd, her eyes fixed on Edmund. He was dismounting, his face pale, his armor stained with blood. He saw her approaching, and a faint smile touched his lips. She rushed to him, her hands reaching out to touch him, to reassure herself that he was alive, that he was safe. You are hurt," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, wincing slightly as he touched the wound on his back.
"It is not serious," he said.
"Thanks to you. And Shadow." He looked up at the sky, where Shadow was circling above, her piercing cry echoing through the arena. He had Marjorie and even his falcon to thank for his life. They led him to his chamber, where Marjorie, using her knowledge of herbs and healing, tended to his wound. She cleaned the cut, applied a poultice of soothing herbs, and bandaged it carefully. He watched her, his gaze filled with gratitude, with admiration, with something more. As she worked, she told him about her desperate plea to Osric, about the release of the falcon, about her fear for his life. He listened, his hand gently clasping hers. You saved me," he said, his voice low, husky. "You risked everything for me." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I could not let him hurt you," she said. I could not bear to lose you." The words, spoken from the heart, hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. The pretense, the formality, the barriers between them, had dissolved, replaced by a raw, undeniable truth. They loved each other. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that traced a path down her cheek. "Marjorie," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. He hesitated, searching for the right words, struggling to express the feelings that had been growing within him, feelings he had long suppressed, denied, believed he did not deserve. "I love you," he confessed, the words barely audible, but sincere, heartfelt. "I have loved you for a long time, since the day I lifted your veil." In the chapel, Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. She had longed to hear those words, dreamed of them, but had never dared to believe they would ever be spoken. "And I love you, Edmund," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have loved you since I don't know when. Perhaps since the moment you showed me kindness, when I least expected it." He leaned forward, his lips gently touching hers, a tentative kiss, a fragile promise, a seal on their shared confession. It was not a passionate kiss, not a fiery embrace, but a tender, heartfelt expression of their love, their trust, their newfound connection. The kiss deepened, fueled by emotions which had for too long gone unspoken. Later, As the keep settled into a restless quiet, they lay together, not in the marriage bed, but on a thick rug before the hearth, wrapped in a shared blanket. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating their faces, their entwined hands. "Renfrew, what will happen to him?" Marjorie asked, her voice soft. Edmund sighed.
"He will be punished," he said.
"For his treachery. He will lose his lands, his titles, his freedom. And his life?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He shook his head.
"No," he said.
"I will not stoop to his level. I will not become like him. Or like my father." He was breaking free from the past, from the cycle of violence and revenge that had defined his family for generations. He was choosing a different path, a path of mercy, of justice, of love. "We have a chance," he said, his voice filled with hope, "to build something new, something better, together." Marjorie nodded, her heart filled with a quiet joy, a profound sense of peace. The night was dark, the future uncertain, but they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The confessions, whispered under the cloak of night, had changed everything. The game was over. The love had begun. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. The aftermath of the tournament brought a period of uneasy calm to Warwick Keep. Renfrew was imprisoned, awaiting trial, his lands and titles forfeit. His co-conspirators were rounded up, questioned, and punished according to their involvement in the plot. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the underlying tensions remained. Edmund, though victorious, was weakened by his injury and by the betrayal of one of his own vassals. He knew that he had enemies, both within and without his borders, who would seek to exploit his vulnerability. He needed to consolidate his power, to strengthen his alliances, to ensure the security of his realm. He called a council of his remaining loyal lords to discuss the situation, to plan their next moves, to reaffirm their oaths of fealty. Marjorie, though not a member of the council, was present, observing the proceedings, listening to the discussions, offering her insights when asked. She saw the way the lords looked at Edmund, a mixture of respect, fear, and uncertainty. They were loyal for now, but loyalty was a fickle thing, easily swayed by power, by ambition, by the promise of reward. She knew that Edmund had to prove himself, to demonstrate his strength, his leadership, his ability to protect them and their interests. One of the lords, a grizzled old warrior named Lord Baldwin, spoke up, his voice gruff and direct. "My lord," he said, "we have stood by you, through thick and thin. We have fought your battles, defended your lands, upheld your honor. But we need assurances. We need to know that you can protect us. From our enemies. From those who would seek to undermine your authority." Edmund nodded, his expression grave. "I understand your concerns," he said. "I know that I have made mistakes. I have alienated some of you. I have not always been the leader you deserved." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled lords.
"But I am learning," he said.
"I am changing. I am striving to be a better lord, a better man." He looked at Marjorie, his eyes filled with a silent plea for support. She met his gaze, her own expression unwavering, conveying her unwavering belief in him, her trust, her love. "I have made a new alliance," Edmund continued, his voice gaining strength. "An alliance that will strengthen our position. An alliance with Winthorn." The lords murmured amongst themselves, surprised by his announcement. Winthorn was their defeated enemy, their conquered foe. How could an alliance with them possibly benefit Warwick? Edmund held up his hand, silencing the murmurs. "Lady Marjorie," he said, "is not just my wife. She is the heir to Winthorn. She is the rightful ruler of those lands. And she has pledged her loyalty to me, to Warwick." He turned to Marjorie, his eyes filled with gratitude, with respect, with love. "Together," he said, "we will rebuild Winthorn. We will restore its prosperity. We will unite our peoples. We will forge a new era of peace and cooperation." Marjorie rose, her head held high, her gaze meeting the eyes of the assembled lords. "I am Marjorie of Winthorn," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And I am also Marjorie of Warwick." I have pledged my loyalty to my husband, to Lord Edmund, and I will honor that pledge with my life." She spoke with conviction, with sincerity, with a quiet strength that commanded respect. The lords, initially skeptical, began to see the wisdom of Edmund's plan. An alliance with Winthorne would not only bring peace, but it would also bring resources, manpower, and a strategic advantage against their common enemies. The council continued for several hours, discussing the details of the alliance, the plans for rebuilding Winthorne, the strategies for defending their borders. Marjorie participated actively, offering her insights, her knowledge of the land, her understanding of the people. As the meeting drew to a close, Lord Baldwin, the old warrior who had initially voiced his concerns, rose to his feet. "My lord," he said, I apologize for my doubts. I see now that you are a wise and just leader, and I reaffirm my oath of fealty to you and to Lady Marjorie." The other lords followed suit, each one pledging their loyalty to Edmund and Marjorie, acknowledging the strength of their alliance, the promise of a better future. Edmund, his face etched with relief and gratitude, thanked them for their support, for their trust. He knew that he had won a crucial victory, not just over Renfrew, but over the doubts and suspicions of his own people. He had proven himself, not just as a warrior, but as a leader, a statesman, a husband. Later that evening, as they stood together on the battlements of the castle, looking out over the snow-covered landscape, Edmund turned to Marjorie, his eyes filled with emotion. You were magnificent," he said, his voice husky. "You swayed them with your strength, your courage, your wisdom." Marjorie smiled, her heart filled with a quiet joy. "We did it together," she said. "We are a team." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. I love you, Marjorie," he said. "More than words can say." "And I love you, Edmund," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. He leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a tender, passionate kiss, a seal on their shared love, their shared triumph, their shared future. The price of loyalty had been high, but they had paid it together. And they had emerged stronger, more united, more in love than ever before. The future was still uncertain, but they faced it, together, with courage, with hope, with unwavering love. Chapter 12. A Kingdom Divided. News of Renfrew's failed rebellion and subsequent imprisonment reached the king's court, causing ripples of unease and speculation throughout the realm. King Alaric, a weak and indecisive ruler, was easily swayed by the counsel of his advisors, many of whom were ambitious and self-serving. He saw Edmund's growing power and influence as a potential threat to his own authority, and he began to listen to the whispers of those who sought to undermine the Lord of Warwick. A royal summons arrived at Warwick Keep, demanding Edmund's presence at court to answer charges of treason and rebellion. The summons was couched in polite terms, but the underlying threat was clear. Edmund was being called to account for his actions, to prove his loyalty to the king, to face the judgment of his peers. Marjorie was furious. She knew that the charges were false, that they were based on lies and misinformation spread by Edmund's enemies. She wanted to fight, to resist, to defy the king's authority. But Edmund was more cautious. He knew that open defiance would be disastrous, that it would lead to war, to the destruction of everything he had worked so hard to build. "We must comply," he said, his voice grave. "We must go to court and face our accusers. We must prove our innocence." Marjorie argued with him, pleaded with him, but he was adamant. He would not risk the lives of his people, the security of his realm, on a reckless act of defiance. He would play the game, follow the rules, even if it meant walking into a trap. They prepared for their journey to the capital, gathering their retainers, packing their belongings, preparing for the long and arduous road ahead. Marjorie insisted on accompanying Edmund, despite his protests. She would not let him face this alone. She would stand by his side, support him, defend him, whatever the cost. The journey was long and difficult, the roads treacherous, the weather harsh. They traveled in silence, for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. Marjorie worried about Edmund, about the dangers he faced at court, about the possibility of imprisonment, even execution. She knew that his enemies were powerful, that they would stop at nothing to destroy him. As they approached the capital, they saw signs of unrest, of division. The kingdom was fractured, split into factions, each vying for power, for influence, for the king's favor. The common people were suffering, burdened by heavy taxes, oppressed by their lords, neglected by their king. The realm was on the brink of chaos, of civil war. They arrived at the capital, a sprawling city of towering castles, bustling markets, and squalid slums. The air was thick with the stench of sewage, the sounds of commerce, the whispers of intrigue. They were escorted to a grand but gloomy manor house, assigned to them as their residence during their stay. It was a gilded cage, a place of confinement, where they were constantly watched, monitored, their every move scrutinized. The following day, they were summoned to the royal court, a vast and opulent hall filled with nobles, courtiers, and officials. King Alaric sat on his throne, a frail and unimpressive figure, surrounded by his advisors. Edmund was brought before him, accused of treason, of plotting against the crown, of inciting rebellion. The accusations were read aloud, a litany of lies and distortions, fabricated by Edmund's enemies. Marjorie listened, her blood boiling, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to protest, to denounce the accusers, but she knew she had to remain silent, to control her emotions, to let Edmund handle this his own way. Edmund, standing tall and proud, denied the charges, his voice clear and strong. He presented evidence of his loyalty, of his service to the crown, of his efforts to maintain peace and stability in his realm. He refuted the accusations, point by point, exposing the lies, revealing the treachery of his enemies. But the king's advisors, led by a cunning and ambitious nobleman named Lord Valerius, were determined to see Edmund condemned. They presented their own evidence, forged documents, false testimonies, twisted interpretations of events. They painted Edmund as a dangerous rebel, a threat to the realm, a man who could not be trusted. The trial dragged on for days, a grueling ordeal of accusations, denials, arguments, and counter-arguments. Marjorie sat beside Edmund, offering him her silent support, her unwavering loyalty, her love. She saw the toll it was taking on him, the fatigue, the stress, the constant pressure. But he never wavered, never faltered, never lost his composure. As the trial neared its conclusion, Marjorie knew that the odds were stacked against them. The king was weak, easily influenced by Valerius and his cronies. The court was biased, the outcome predetermined. Edmund was going to be found guilty. She had to do something, anything, to save him. She could not stand by and watch him be condemned, imprisoned, perhaps even executed. She had to act, even if it meant risking her own life. The kingdom was divided, but her heart was not. She knew where her loyalty lay, and she would fight for it, to the very end. She began to consider a bold, desperate plan, a gamble that could either save them both, or destroy them utterly. Chapter 13. Flight from the Falcon's Nest. Marjorie knew she had to act swiftly and decisively. The trial was nearing its end, and the verdict was all but certain: guilty. She couldn't let Edmund be condemned, imprisoned, or worse. She had to find a way to get him out of the capital, out of the king's reach, back to the safety of Warwick Keep. She began to formulate a plan, a daring and dangerous escape, fraught with risks, but it was their only hope. She needed allies, trusted individuals who would help them, who would risk their own lives to save Edmund. She secretly contacted Alara, who had accompanied them to the capital, and a few other loyal retainers who had remained at Warwick Keep. She sent coded messages, using the falconry terms they had established earlier, outlining her plan, instructing them to prepare for their return, to gather supplies, to secure a safe passage out of the city. She also sought out a secret passage, a hidden escape route from the manor house where they were being held. She explored the building, searching for any sign of a forgotten tunnel, a hidden door, anything that could lead them to freedom. She discovered a dusty and used cellar beneath the kitchens where a section of the walls seemed different. It was made of newer stone, less weathered than the rest, and it sounded hollow. She suspected it was a sealed-up entrance to an old tunnel, perhaps a secret passage used long ago, forgotten by time. She needed to find a way to open it, to clear the passage, to make it passable. She enlisted the help of Agnes, the serving woman who had been assigned to her, the one who had shown her quiet kindnesses, the one she felt she could trust. Agnes, though initially hesitant, agreed to help, her loyalty to Marjorie outweighing her fear of the consequences. Together, they worked in secret late at night, after everyone else was asleep. They chipped away at the mortar, loosened the stones, slowly, carefully, revealing the opening to the tunnel. It was a dark, damp, and claustrophobic space, filled with cobwebs and dust, but it was a path to freedom. On the final day of the trial, as expected, Edmund was found guilty of treason. The king, swayed by Valerius's arguments, sentenced him to imprisonment in the royal dungeons, pending further consideration of his fate. It was a death sentence in disguise. Marjorie, though outwardly calm, was seething with anger and despair. But she knew she had to act quickly. The escape plan had to be put into motion immediately. As Edmund was being led away by the guards, Marjorie slipped a small, folded piece of parchment into his hand, a message containing the details of the escape plan, the location of the secret passage, the time of their departure. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and love. That night, as the city slept, Marjorie and Edmund, aided by Agnes, made their escape. They crept through the darkened corridors of the manor house, down to the cellar, and into the secret passage. The tunnel was narrow and winding, leading them beneath the city walls, towards the outskirts of the capital. They emerged from the tunnel, into a cold, dark night, the air crisp and clean, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the city. They were met by a small group of loyal retainers, led by Alara, who had horses and supplies waiting for them. They mounted their horses and rode swiftly, silently, away from the capital, towards the north, towards Warwick Keep. They knew that they were being pursued, that the king's guards would be searching for them, that they were outlaws, fugitives from justice. But they were free. As they rode, Marjorie looked back at the city, its lights twinkling in the distance, a symbol of the tyranny they had escaped. She felt a surge of relief, of gratitude, of hope. They had survived. They were together, and they were going home. But the journey was far from over. They had to evade their pursuers, to navigate treacherous terrain, to find safe passage through a kingdom divided by war and intrigue. They had to rely on their wits, their courage, their love for each other. Edmund, riding beside her, reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We escaped." Marjorie nodded, her heart filled with a quiet joy, a profound sense of peace. They had fled the falcon's nest, the gilded cage of the royal court, and they were flying free, towards a new dawn, a new future. The flight was perilous, but they were together. And that was all that mattered. The escape had been successful, but the journey had just begun. Chapter 14. The Sanctuary of Secrets. The journey back to Warwick Keep was arduous and fraught with peril. Marjorie, Edmund, and their small band of loyal retainers traveled mostly at night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to hidden paths and forest trails. They knew that the king's men were searching for them, that every town and village was a potential trap, that betrayal could lurk around every corner. They slept little, ate sparingly, and rode hard, pushing their horses to their limits. They relied on Alara's knowledge of the countryside, her familiarity with secret routes and safe havens, to guide them through the treacherous terrain. Marjorie, despite her exhaustion and fear, proved to be a resourceful and resilient companion. She used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend to their injuries, to soothe their frayed nerves, to keep their spirits up. She also proved to be a skilled horsewoman, riding with a grace and confidence that surprised even Edmund. Edmund, though still recovering from his injury, led them with unwavering determination, his courage and resolve inspiring them all. He was a natural leader, a warrior born, and his men followed him without question, their loyalty absolute. One evening, as they were camped in a dense forest, hidden from prying eyes, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter from Osric, the falconer. The message was brief and urgent. Warwick Keep was under siege. Lord Valerius, having failed to capture Edmund in the capital, had marched on Warwick with a large force, determined to seize the castle and crush any remaining resistance. He had convinced the king that Edmund was a traitor, that he was plotting to overthrow the crown, and that Warwick Keep was a hotbed of rebellion. Marjorie's heart sank. She had hoped to find refuge at Warwick, to rally their forces, to prepare for a final stand. But now their home was under attack, their people in danger, their future uncertain. Edmund, his face grim, gathered his men around the campfire. He read Osric's message aloud, his voice firm and resolute.
We have a choice, he said.
We can turn back, seek refuge elsewhere, or we can go to Warwick and fight. The men murmured amongst themselves, their faces etched with concern, with fear, but also with determination. They were loyal to Edmund, to Warwick, to their home. They would not abandon their families, their friends, their people, without a fight. We will go to Warwick, said one of the men, a grizzled old sergeant named Gareth. We will fight. For our homes. For our families. For our Lord. The other men echoed his words, their voices filled with a fierce resolve. They would fight. They would defend Warwick. They would stand by Edmund, to the death. Marjorie, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear, looked at Edmund, her eyes shining with admiration. He had inspired them, united them, given them hope in the face of overwhelming odds. We will go to Warwick, Edmund said, his voice unwavering. But we will not go directly. We will seek another path. A secret path. He turned to Marjorie, his eyes filled with a question, a silent plea for help. He knew that she had knowledge of the land, of hidden passages, of forgotten routes. He was relying on her wisdom, on her courage. Marjorie nodded. There is a way, she said. A sanctuary. A place where we can gather our strength and plan our next move. She told them about a hidden monastery, nestled deep in the mountains, a place of peace and refuge, known only to a few. It was a place where she had spent time as a child, learning from the monks, studying their ancient texts, exploring their secret gardens. The monastery was located near a network of hidden tunnels and caves, a labyrinthine underworld that could provide them with a safe passage to Warwick, bypassing Valerius's forces. It was a dangerous route, fraught with risks, but it was their best hope. They set off, following Marjorie's lead, towards the mountains, towards the sanctuary of secrets. The journey was even more arduous than before, the terrain rugged and unforgiving, the weather harsh and unpredictable. But they persevered, driven by their loyalty to Edmund, their determination to save Warwick, their love for each other. As they approached the monastery, Marjorie felt a sense of peace, of familiarity, of hope. It was a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the storm, a place where they could find strength, guidance, and perhaps a way to win the war that was looming on the horizon. The sanctuary was their only hope, and Marjorie knew its secrets well. It was time to put them to use. The flight had led them to a place of refuge, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 15. Echoes of Betrayal. The monastery, nestled high in the rugged mountains, was a haven of peace and tranquility. The imposing stone buildings, surrounded by ancient forests and towering peaks, exuded an aura of serenity and timeless wisdom. The monks, clad in simple brown robes, welcomed Marjorie and Edmund with quiet kindness, offering them food, shelter, and sanctuary. Marjorie felt a sense of homecoming as she walked through the familiar cloisters, the scent of incense and old parchment filling her senses. She remembered her childhood visits, the hours she had spent in the library, poring over ancient texts, learning from the wise and gentle monks. The abbot, a venerable old man with a long white beard and piercing blue eyes, greeted Marjorie with a warm embrace. He remembered her well, her inquisitive mind, her thirst for knowledge, her spirit. "Welcome, child," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You have returned in a time of need." Marjorie explained their situation, the flight from the capital, the siege of Warwick Keep, the treachery of Lord Valerius. The abbot listened intently, his expression grave. "The world is in turmoil," he said. "Darkness has fallen upon the land. But there is always hope, even in the darkest of times." He offered them his support, his guidance, and the resources of the monastery. He showed them the secret tunnels and caves that lay beneath the buildings, a labyrinthine network that could provide them with a safe passage to Warwick, bypassing Valerius's forces. Edmund, grateful for the abbot's assistance, began to plan their next move. He sent scouts to gather intelligence, to assess the strength of Valerius's army, to identify any weaknesses in their defenses. He also began to train his men, preparing them for the battle that lay ahead. Marjorie, meanwhile, explored the monastery, seeking solace in the familiar surroundings, drawing strength from the quiet wisdom of the monks. She spent hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, searching for any knowledge that could help them in their fight. One day, as she was browsing through a dusty collection of scrolls, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment, concealed behind a bookshelf. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with a familiar handwriting. It was her mother's journal. Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. She had never known her mother to keep a journal. She opened the book, her hands trembling, and began to read. The journal entries were filled with her mother's thoughts, her feelings, her secrets. Marjorie learned about her mother's love for her father, her devotion to Winthorne, her struggles with the constraints of her arranged marriage. But as she read further, she discovered a shocking truth, a revelation that shattered her understanding of her family, of her past, of everything. Her mother had had a secret lover, a man she had loved deeply, passionately, a man who was not her husband. And that man was Edmund's father. Marjorie's world tilted on its axis. The man she had been taught to hate, the man who had destroyed her family, was the son of her mother's lover. The blood feud between Winthorne and Warwick, the generations of hatred and violence, was based on a lie, a secret betrayal, a hidden connection. She felt a wave of nausea, of disbelief, of anger. Her mother had kept this secret from her, from everyone. She had allowed the feud to continue, the bloodshed to escalate, the hatred to fester. She closed the journal, her hands shaking, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to do, what to think, what to feel. She had discovered a truth that could change everything, that could shatter the fragile peace they had found, that could destroy the love she had found with Edmund. She sought out Edmund, needing to share her discovery, to seek his counsel, to unburden herself of the terrible secret. She found him in the monastery gardens, practicing his swordsmanship, his movements fluid and graceful, his face etched with concentration. She hesitated, unsure how to begin, how to reveal the truth that could tear them apart. But she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. She had to tell him. "Edmund," she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you. About my mother. And your father." He stopped his practice, his sword lowered, his gaze turning to her, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" he asked. "What has happened?" She took a deep breath and told him everything. She showed him the journal, the entries that revealed the truth, the secret love affair, the hidden connection between their families. Edmund listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his emotions masked. As she finished, he closed his eyes, his face pale, his body trembling. The echoes of betrayal reverberated through the quiet sanctuary, threatening to shatter the fragile peace they had found. The past, it seemed, was not yet finished with them. Chapter 16. The Unseen Enemy. Edmund stood in stunned silence, the weight of Marjorie's revelation pressing down on him like a physical blow. He had known his father was a harsh, unforgiving man, but he had never imagined this. A secret affair with Marjorie's mother, a betrayal that had fueled generations of hatred and bloodshed between their families. It was almost too much to bear. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Marjorie's, his expression a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. I do not know what to say, he said, his voice hoarse. I need time to process this. He turned and walked away, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped. He needed to be alone, to think, to grapple with the implications of this shocking discovery. He wandered through the monastery gardens, his mind reeling, his heart aching. Marjorie watched him go, her own heart filled with a mixture of guilt, fear, and understanding. She had shattered his world, revealed a truth that could destroy their love, their fragile alliance, their future. She had done what she had to do, but the consequences were terrifying. She spent the rest of the day in the monastery library, seeking solace in the familiar surroundings, trying to make sense of the tangled web of her family's history. She reread her mother's journal, searching for any clue, any explanation, any justification for her actions. But there was none. Only a story of forbidden love, of betrayal, of regret. As evening approached, she returned to their shared chamber, unsure of what to expect. Edmund was there, sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. He turned as she entered, his face etched with a profound sadness. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low and strained, about our families, about the feud, about everything. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken pain. It changes nothing, he said, his voice firm, resolute. And it changes everything. Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. She had expected anger, rejection, accusations. But he was offering her understanding? Acceptance? What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. He moved towards her, his hand reaching out to gently cup her face. I mean that the past is the past, he said. We cannot change it. We cannot undo the wrongs that were done. But we can choose a different future. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the generations of hatred, the blood feud, the betrayal. I love you, Marjorie, he said. That is all that matters. Our family's sins are not ours.
We are not bound by them.
Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming love. He was offering her forgiveness, acceptance, a chance to build a future together, free from the shadows of the past. And I love you, Edmund, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. He leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a tender, passionate kiss, a seal on their renewed commitment, their unwavering love, their shared destiny. The past was a burden, but they would carry it together, and they would not let it destroy them. But as they embraced, a shadow fell across the room. A figure emerged from the darkness, a cloaked and hooded figure, holding a drawn sword. It was not one of Valerius's men, not a soldier from the king's army. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. I am sorry, the figure said, their voice distorted by the hood, but still recognizable. But this is the only way. The figure lunged forward, the sword aimed at Edmund's heart. Marjorie screamed, a wordless cry of terror, as she realized the identity of their attacker, the unseen enemy who had been lurking among them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was someone they had never suspected, someone who had betrayed them in the most profound and devastating way. The revelation was as shocking as the blade that now threatened their lives. The enemy was not who they expected, and the fight was far from over. Chapter 17. Trials of Fire and Blood. The hooded figure lunged, the sword a silver flash in the dim light of the chamber. Marjorie's scream echoed through the room as she instinctively pushed Edmund aside, shielding him with her own body. The blade, meant for him, grazed her arm, drawing blood, but she barely felt the pain. Her only thought was to protect him, to save him from the treacherous attack. Edmund, momentarily stunned by the suddenness of the assault, reacted swiftly. He drew his own sword, which he had kept close at hand even within the sanctuary of the monastery, and parried the attacker's next blow. The clash of steel rang out, a sharp, discordant note in the otherwise peaceful setting.
Who are you?
Edmund demanded, his voice a low growl, his eyes narrowed with fury. Show yourself. The figure hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered their hood, revealing their face. It was Agnes, the serving woman, the one Marjorie had trusted, the one who had helped them escape from the capital. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Marjorie gasped, her mind reeling. Agnes?
But why?
Agnes looked at her, her expression sorrowful, but resolute. I had no choice, she said, her voice trembling. They have my family, my children. They threatened to kill them if I did not obey. She was a pawn, a victim, caught in a web of treachery and deceit, forced to betray the people she had come to care for. Valerius, it seemed, had spies everywhere, his reach extending even into the sanctuary of the monastery. Edmund, his face hardened with anger, lowered his sword slightly, but his guard remained up. Who are they? He asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Who is behind this? Agnes hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. I cannot say, she whispered. They will kill me. They will kill my children. Marjorie, her arm bleeding, stepped forward, her voice filled with a mixture of compassion and desperation. Agnes, please, she pleaded.
Tell us.
We can help you. We can protect your family. Agnes looked at her, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to believe her, to trust her, but the fear was too great, the threat too real. Suddenly, a sharp whistling sound pierced the air. A small dart, tipped with poison, struck Agnes in the neck. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock and pain, and crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Edmund and Marjorie stared in horror at the fallen serving woman, their minds racing. Who had fired the dart? Who was the unseen enemy, lurking in the shadows, controlling the events, pulling the strings? Edmund quickly searched the room, his sword raised, but the attacker was gone. They had vanished as quickly and silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only death and unanswered questions. The monks, alerted by the commotion, rushed into the chamber, their faces filled with alarm and concern. They saw Agnes's body, the blood on Marjorie's arm, the drawn swords. They understood immediately that the sanctuary had been violated, that the darkness had followed them even into this place of peace. The abbot, his face grave, ordered the monastery to be searched, the gates secured, the guards doubled. He knew that they were no longer safe, that the enemy was within their walls, that they were surrounded by danger. Marjorie, her wound tended to by one of the monks, sat beside Edmund, her heart heavy with grief and fear. Agnes, a victim of circumstance, had paid the ultimate price for her forced betrayal. And the true enemy, the mastermind behind the plot, remained unknown, unseen, a constant threat lurking in the shadows. We are not safe here, Edmund said, his voice low and grim. We must leave. We must go to Warwick and fight. He knew that the time for hiding was over, that they had to confront their enemies, to defend their home, to protect their people. He also knew that the battle would be long and bloody, that the odds were stacked against them, that they might not survive. But he was not afraid. He had Marjorie by his side, his love, his strength, his reason to fight. He had the loyalty of his men, the support of the monks, and the hope of a better future. They prepared to leave the monastery, gathering their supplies, arming themselves, preparing for the final confrontation. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that Valerius was waiting for them, that the battle for Warwick Keep would be a trial by fire and blood. As they rode out of the monastery gates, under the cover of darkness, Marjorie looked back at the sanctuary, its walls silhouetted against the starry sky. It had been a place of refuge, a place of healing, a place of revelation. But now it was time to leave, to face the dangers that awaited them, to fight for their love, their freedom, their destiny. The trials were upon them, and they would face them together. Chapter 18. A Revelation of Hearts. The ride to Warwick Keep was swift and silent, the small band of riders moving like shadows through the night. Edmund, his face grim and determined, led the way, his senses on high alert, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Marjorie rode beside him, her own fear masked by a fierce resolve, her hand resting on the hilt of a small dagger she had concealed beneath her cloak. They reached the outskirts of Warwick as dawn broke, the sky painted with hues of gray and pink. The castle, perched high on its rocky outcrop, loomed before them, a symbol of strength and defiance, but also of vulnerability. They could see the siege engines surrounding the walls, the tents of Valerius's army, the smoke rising from the burning fields. They knew they couldn't approach the castle directly, that they would be intercepted and captured. They needed to find a way to enter the fortress secretly, to join the defenders, to rally their forces. Edmund remembered the network of tunnels and caves beneath the monastery, the secret passage that the abbot had shown them. He knew that a similar network existed beneath Warwick Keep, a hidden labyrinth built centuries ago, known only to a few trusted individuals. He led them towards a hidden entrance, a small, unassuming opening concealed beneath a thicket of trees, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. They dismounted, tethered their horses, and entered the darkness, their footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. The tunnels were narrow and winding, a claustrophobic maze that tested their courage and resolve. They moved slowly, carefully, guided by Edmund's memory and Marjorie's knowledge of the land. They encountered obstacles, dead ends, crumbling walls, but they persevered, driven by their determination to reach Warwick, to fight for their home. As they navigated the labyrinth, they heard the sounds of battle echoing above them, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying. They knew that the siege was raging, that their people were fighting for their lives, that they had to reach them soon. Suddenly, they heard voices ahead, whispers in the darkness. They stopped, their hearts pounding, their hands gripping their weapons. Were they friend or foe? Had they been discovered? Edmund cautiously approached the source of the voices, his sword raised. He peered around a corner and saw a group of Warwick soldiers, huddled together, their faces grim, their armor stained with blood and dirt. They were defenders, survivors, who had retreated into the tunnels to escape the onslaught above. Edmund revealed himself, his voice a low whisper. We are friends, he said. We are here to help. The soldiers, initially startled, recognized Edmund and lowered their weapons. They were relieved, overjoyed, to see their lord, to know that he had returned, that he was alive, that he had come to lead them. Edmund quickly learned the situation. The castle was under heavy attack, the walls breached in several places, the defenders outnumbered and outmatched. Valerius's forces were relentless, brutal, determined to take Warwick Keep at any cost. But the defenders, inspired by the return of their lord, were not ready to surrender. They were fighting fiercely, bravely, defending their home, their families, their freedom. Edmund rallied them, his voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose, of determination. We will fight, he said. We will defend Warwick. We will not surrender. He led them through the tunnels, towards the heart of the castle, towards the main gate, where the fighting was most intense. They emerged from the darkness, into the chaos of battle, their swords raised, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The sight of Edmund, returning from the dead, as it were, sent a wave of hope and courage through the Warwick defenders. They cheered, their spirits lifted, their resolve strengthened. They fought with renewed vigor, pushing back Valerius's forces, reclaiming lost ground. Marjorie, fighting alongside Edmund, proved to be a formidable warrior in her own right. She wielded her dagger with skill and precision, defending herself, protecting Edmund, fighting for the people she had come to love. As they fought, Edmund saw Valerius across the battlefield, his face contorted with rage and frustration. He knew that he had to confront him, to defeat him, to end the siege, to save Warwick. He charged towards Valerius, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his battle cry echoing through the din of combat. The two men clashed, their swords meeting with a deafening clang, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. They fought with a ferocity born of hatred and desperation, each determined to kill the other, to end the conflict once and for all. Valerius, fueled by ambition and a thirst for power, was a formidable opponent, his skills honed by years of warfare. But Edmund, driven by love, by loyalty, by a righteous fury, was stronger, more determined, more alive. As they fought, Marjorie saw a figure creeping up behind Edmund, a hidden assassin, armed with a poisoned dagger, ready to strike. It was the same unseen enemy who had killed Agnes, the puppet master who had been pulling the strings all along. She recognized the figure, and a gasp escaped her lips. It was Lord Baldwin, the grizzled old warrior, the one who had pledged his loyalty to Edmund, the one who had seemed so steadfast and true. He had been a traitor all along, a secret agent of Valerius, working from within to undermine Edmund, to destroy Warwick. The final, devastating betrayal. "Edmund, behind you!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the din of battle. Edmund, hearing her warning, reacted instantly. He spun around, parrying the assassin's blow, his sword deflecting the poisoned dagger. He saw Baldwin's face, his eyes filled with a cold, ruthless hatred. "You," Edmund said, his voice filled with disbelief and disgust. "You betrayed us." Baldwin smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. "I serve the true king," he said. "The strong king, not a weakling, or a woman's puppet." He lunged at Edmund again, his sword raised, but Edmund was ready for him. He parried the blow, disarmed Baldwin, and with a swift, decisive move, ran him through with his sword. Baldwin crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood staining the earth, his betrayal avenged. The revelation of hearts, of loyalties and betrayals, was complete. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. Chapter 19. The Siege of Warwick Keep. With Baldwin dead, the tide of the battle began to turn. Edmund, fueled by righteous fury and a desperate need to protect his home and his loved one, fought with a ferocity that inspired his men and struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. He cut down Valerius's soldiers with relentless efficiency, his sword a blur of silver in the sunlight. Marjorie, fighting alongside him, proved to be an invaluable ally. She used her knowledge of the castle layout to guide them through the chaos, leading them to strategic points, helping them to outmaneuver Valerius's forces. She also used her skills as a healer to tend to the wounded, offering them comfort and relief in the midst of the carnage. The Warwick defenders, inspired by Edmund's return and Marjorie's courage, fought with renewed vigor. They pushed back Valerius's forces, reclaiming lost ground, driving them from the castle walls. The battle raged for hours, a brutal and bloody struggle for control of Warwick Keep. Edmund finally confronted Valerius, their duel resuming amidst the chaos of the wider conflict. Valerius, his initial confidence shattered by Baldwin's death and the resurgence of the Warwick defenders, fought with a desperate, almost frantic energy. He was a skilled swordsman, but he was no match for Edmund's righteous fury and unwavering determination. Edmund pressed his attack, forcing Valerius onto the defensive. He parried, thrust, and riposted, his sword movements fluid and precise. He saw the fear in Valerius's eyes, the realization that he was defeated, that his ambition had led him to ruin. With a final, powerful blow, Edmund disarmed Valerius, sending his sword clattering to the ground. Valerius stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror, his body trembling. He was at Edmund's mercy. Edmund raised his sword, ready to deliver the killing blow, to end the threat once and for all. But he hesitated. He looked at Valerius, at the fear and desperation in his eyes, and he saw a reflection of his own past, of the darkness that had once consumed him. He lowered his sword, his voice firm and resolute. I will not kill you," he said. "I will not become like you, or like my father." He was choosing mercy over vengeance, forgiveness over hatred. He was breaking the cycle of violence that had plagued his family for generations. He was choosing a different path, a path of peace. He ordered his men to take Valerius prisoner, to hold him for trial, to let justice, not revenge, determine his fate. The Warwick defenders, though initially surprised by Edmund's decision, obeyed his command. They had seen his courage, his leadership, his compassion. They trusted him, implicitly. With Valerius captured, the remaining enemy soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, surrendered. The siege of Warwick Keep was over. The battle had been won. The cost had been high. Many brave men and women had lost their lives, defending their home, their families, their freedom. The castle was damaged, scarred by the fighting, but it still stood, a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of hope. Marjorie rushed to Edmund's side, her heart filled with relief and gratitude. She embraced him, holding him tight, her tears mixing with the sweat and blood that stained his armor. You did it," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." He held her close, his own eyes filled with tears. We did it together," he said. "We are a team." They stood together, amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, surrounded by their victorious but weary people. The cheers of the survivors were a balm to their souls, a testament to their courage, their leadership, their love. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battered castle, Edmund and Marjorie stood on the battlements, looking out over their land. The fighting was over, the siege lifted, the enemy defeated. But the rebuilding, the healing, the reconciliation was just beginning. They knew that the challenges ahead were many, that the kingdom was still divided, that the future was still uncertain. But they also knew that they had each other, that they had the loyalty of their people, that they had the strength and the courage to face whatever came their way. They had survived the trials of fire and blood, the betrayals, the losses, the darkness. And they had emerged stronger, more united, more in love than ever before. The siege was over, but the rebuilding of their lives, their home, their kingdom, was just beginning. And they would face it, together, with hope, with courage, with unwavering love. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The days following the lifting of the siege were filled with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the daunting task of rebuilding. Warwick Keep, though scarred by battle, stood defiant, a testament to the courage and resilience of its defenders. The immediate threat had passed, but the kingdom remained fractured, and the future was far from certain. Edmund, though weary from the fighting and the constant weight of leadership, immediately set about restoring order and security. He oversaw the repair of the castle walls, the burial of the dead, the tending of the wounded. He also sent messengers to the neighboring lords, reaffirming his loyalty to the king, but also making it clear that he would defend his lands and his people against any further aggression. Marjorie worked tirelessly alongside him, using her knowledge of healing to care for the injured, her organizational skills to help distribute supplies, and her quiet strength to comfort the grieving. She was no longer just the Lady of Winthorn, a forced bride, a symbol of conquest. She was a leader, a healer, a partner, a beloved wife. The trial of Lord Valerius was swift and decisive. He was found guilty of treason, of inciting rebellion, of attempted murder. He was stripped of his titles, his lands, and sentenced to life imprisonment in the royal dungeons. Edmund, despite the pleas of some of his advisors for a harsher punishment, refused to execute him. He was determined to break the cycle of vengeance, to build a future based on justice, not revenge. The issue of Agnes and Lord Baldwin's treachery was more complex. Edmund, after much deliberation, decided to keep Baldwin's betrayal a secret for the sake of unity and morale. He announced that Baldwin had died a hero's death, defending the castle against Valerius's forces. It was a lie, but a necessary one, to prevent further division and distrust among his people. Agnes's death was attributed to a stray arrow, her sacrifice unknown to all but a select few. With the immediate crisis averted, Edmund and Marjorie turned their attention to the longer-term challenges facing their realm. They knew that they needed to strengthen their alliances, to rebuild their economy, to heal the wounds of war. They also knew that they needed to address the underlying causes of the conflict, the divisions within the kingdom, the weakness of the king, the ambition of the nobles. They decided to travel to the capital to meet with King Alaric, to present their case, to offer their counsel, to try to forge a new path towards peace and stability. It was a risky undertaking, given the king's past susceptibility to the influence of Edmund's enemies, but they felt it was a necessary one. Before they departed, they held a solemn ceremony in the castle chapel, a memorial service for those who had lost their lives during the siege. Marjorie, standing beside Edmund, spoke to the assembled mourners, her voice filled with emotion, but also with strength and hope. We have suffered greatly, she said. We have lost loved ones. We have seen the horrors of war. But we have also shown courage. We have shown resilience. We have shown love. She looked at Edmund, her eyes shining with a deep and abiding affection.
We will rebuild, she said.
We will heal. We will create a better future. For ourselves. For our children. For all of us. Her words resonated with the mourners, offering them comfort, solace, and a renewed sense of purpose. They had been through a crucible of fire, but they had emerged stronger, more united, more determined to build a better world. As Edmund and Marjorie prepared for their journey to the capital, they knew that they faced a daunting task, a reckoning with the forces that had sought to destroy them. They were under no illusions about the dangers that awaited them, the political intrigues, the hidden enemies, the uncertain future. But they also knew that they had each other, that they had the loyalty of their people, that they had a vision of a better world, a world based on justice, on compassion, on love. They were ready to face the reckoning, to fight for their beliefs, to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. They embraced a long, tender embrace, filled with the unspoken promise of their love, their commitment, their shared destiny. They were bound together, not just by duty, not just by vows, but by a deep and abiding affection, a love that had been forged in the crucible of conflict, a love that would endure, whatever the future held. The reckoning of love and duty was at hand, and they would face it together, with courage, with hope, with unwavering faith in each other. Epilogue. The journey to the capital was uneventful, a stark contrast to their previous flight. Edmund and Marjorie, accompanied by a small, loyal escort, traveled openly, their banners bearing the combined crests of Warwick and Winthorne, a symbol of their unity, their strength, their defiance. They arrived at the capital, not as fugitives, but as respected lords, their reputations preceding them. The news of their victory at Warwick Keep, of Valerius's capture, of Baldwin's supposed heroic death, had spread throughout the realm, bolstering their standing and undermining the influence of their enemies. King Alaric, weakened by illness and increasingly aware of his own vulnerability, received them with a cautious courtesy. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of Edmund's growing power, of Marjorie's influence, of their combined strength. He was wary, uncertain, but also intrigued. Edmund, speaking with calm authority, presented their case. He recounted the events of the past months, the treachery of Valerius, the siege of Warwick Keep, the sacrifices that had been made. He also spoke of his vision for the future, a future of peace, of stability, of cooperation. He proposed a new alliance, a council of lords, representing all the regions of the kingdom, to advise the king, to share the burden of governance, to prevent the rise of ambitious and self-serving individuals like Valerius. He offered his own services, his loyalty, his strength, to help rebuild the fractured realm. Marjorie, standing beside Edmund, added her own voice to the plea for unity and reform. She spoke of the suffering of the common people, the devastation of war, the need for justice and compassion. She spoke of the importance of healing, of reconciliation, of forgiveness. Her words, spoken with sincerity and passion, resonated with the king and with many of the assembled nobles. They saw in her a leader, a healer, a symbol of hope. They saw in her and Edmund a chance for a better future, a future free from the constant strife and conflict that had plagued the kingdom for so long. King Alaric, after much deliberation, agreed to Edmund's proposal. He established a new council of lords, with Edmund as its head, to advise him on matters of state, to help him govern the realm. He also formally recognized the union of Warwick and Winthorne, acknowledging Marjorie's rightful claim to her ancestral lands. It was a victory, not just for Edmund and Marjorie, but for the entire kingdom. It was a step towards peace, towards stability, towards a better future. But it was only the beginning. The challenges ahead were many, the divisions deep, the wounds of war still fresh. Edmund and Marjorie returned to Warwick Keep, not to rest, but to continue the work of rebuilding, of healing, of leading. They ruled wisely and justly, their combined strength and wisdom guiding their decisions. They fostered trade, encouraged agriculture, rebuilt infrastructure, and promoted education. They also started a family, their love blossoming into new life, a symbol of hope and renewal. They had children, sons and daughters, who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, their compassion. Years passed, and the kingdom slowly began to heal. The scars of war remained, but they were fading, replaced by a growing sense of unity, of purpose, of shared destiny. Edmund and Marjorie, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, continued to rule, their love for each other and for their people, undiminished. They often stood together on the battlements of Warwick Keep, looking out over their land, a land that had been ravaged by war, but was now flourishing, a land that had been divided, but was now united, a land that had been filled with despair, but was now filled with hope. They had faced trials of fire and blood, betrayals and losses, darkness and despair. But they had emerged stronger, more united, more in love than ever before. They had built a better world, not just for themselves, but for their children, for their people, for generations to come. Their love story, born in the midst of conflict, had become a legend, a testament to the power of forgiveness, of resilience, of unwavering devotion. The marriage of fire and ice had melted into a single, enduring flame, a beacon of hope for a kingdom reborn. The end.